The way we design, build, and operate buildings is undergoing a radical transformation. Welcome to ACE IoT Flight Logs. I'm Andrew Rodgers, co-founder of ACE IoT Solutions, and I've spent years immersed in the world of smart building technology. Join me as I learn from the industry's leading innovators, researchers, engineers, technicians, and more, how we can revolutionize the entire life cycle of the built environment. Get ready to take flight and explore the future of how buildings are delivered and operated. So glad to be back with James Coleman. Obviously, we're in a little different setting today. The weather has taken a turn for the worse, so a little more indoor focused. Still a beautiful day in Austin, Texas. Thanks so much for coming back, James. This topic is obviously really interesting given how much we've had to talk about. So we talked a little bit about service. That's a key part that everyone touches, right? Like everyone that we're talking to, the audience we're talking to, they have a building, it has some sort of automation system, and it has to have service. I'm also curious about folks who are either, at a capital equipment upgrade point where they're about to, requisition a new BMS as part of a larger, building remodeling project or just technology upgrade. What are those key components? How does someone know if they have a good BMS now? Maybe they don't need to replace it. And B, like, what do they need to be thinking about specifying in future, requisitions to ensure they're getting a good result for their investment?
Great question. I'm going to start with the cynical answer, which is that in my personal experience, it hasn't been that I'm upgrading because I want to. It's more often that I'm upgrading because I have to, usually because some legacy piece of software that I depend on is being sunset. And yeah, for better or worse, I find myself in a place where I have to upgrade. So that's been my experience more often than not. But because of capital allocation cycles or just things are getting to end of life, you find yourself in the position that I have an opportunity to upgrade things. I think the thing where I would start looking at is how have my needs changed from when that initial system was put in to my current needs. And when I say that, I'm sort of teeing up the fact that new services come onto the market far more quickly than the replacement cycle of BAS equipment. And so you may find yourself in a position where if 15 years ago, the last time you did any kind of serious BAS upgrade work, you didn't really have an interest or an appetite for doing serious analytics work at the building level. Evaluating that now, that is something that I would like to be doing, and sort of doing the gap analysis between previously, it was damn near impossible to get data out of my system. I want to make this seamless going forward. That's the kind of gap analysis that I would be thinking about if that time is approaching where I might have a chance to upgrade some stuff.
I guess diving into that a little bit more. So capacity for things like analytics, that seems to be a key. That's a key metric. Maybe supervisory control, grid response. Those are all things that you might evaluate as, do I have a need for these things? And does my system have the capacity, even if not to do it today as part of this capital retrofit, but to have that capacity to know if I'm interested in it later? Is there standardization of these things? Like, do we have a good framework for saying, oh yeah, this system supports this standard, therefore, I'll be able to do, participate in a demand market? Or is all that stuff still pretty ad hoc?
I think in a binary sense, are there standards that I can call out in a set of bid documents? Absolutely. I think the one that you were alluding to is like, can, as an example, this new BAS support direct open demand response? Is that the name? Wow, I'm blanking.
Open ADR.
Thank you.
Open
Open
automated
ADR.
Demand.
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah. Right.
So that's a standard.
That's correct. And that's this thing that is actually supported by not a tremendous number of platforms, but certainly some of the bigger ones. And so that's absolutely the kind of thing that I can put in a spec doc or a set of bid documents. I think also,
But
yes, go ahead.
and I guess this is the question, is like those standards are, I think as an industry we have created, like, we all rely on bid specs and we put things in there like these standards,
Mm-hmm.
but those standards are interfaces and they're not capabilities. So you can have a BAS that's got OpenADR as a supported interface, and you can wire that OpenADR into your utilities, demand market.
Yeah.
But then if there's not programming in the BAS, or the sequences themselves aren't designed where you can interject some demand thresholds,
Mm-hmm.
nothing's going to happen. Is there I guess my opinion is we don't have standards for functionality yet.
Yeah,
Is there
agreed.
room for them? Is there, like, guideline 36, certainly on like advanced control systems, that's the one I think has seen the most success in the market. Really excited about what it's enabling
Yeah.
because it does level the playing field feature for feature between things.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a future where there's like this functionality standard? Is that possible? Is the industry too broken to ever adopt that? That's very leading questions. I
No, that's
know, but
okay. I think the answer to that is no. I think that, is it possible? Sure, it is. Is it commonplace? No, it doesn't largely exist at all. But I think that, so sorry, if I may take a quick step back, I think you make a good point, which we should just be really clear about. That um, while I can specify a open, well, potentially open and standard interface, that doesn't necessarily guarantee, and in fact has no bearing on whether or not the functionality of my system will necessarily deliver any of the things that I think are enabled by that interface. However, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like if today I I don't have the budget to, as an example, go and procure a whole bunch of demand response sequences. Like it's just not allocated. I can't do it. Sliding into my specification doc that I need support for OpenADR today does at least set me up in the future to not have to have a higher upfront cost when I go to deliver those sequences. So I do think that there's a value, even if you can't afford to do the functional sort of standards from the hop, there is still value in making sure that the interfaces you require at the outset facilitate your functional requirements in the future. So that's just one thing I wanted to say. But to your point about like, is there a future state where we have sort of standard functional requirements? Um, Absolutely, and I think guideline 36 is a great example. Like I could absolutely say in a specification document, this particular piece of equipment is going to operate with this specified logic per ASHRAE guideline 36. That's great. That's a good place to start. And I think slightly farther down the pipeline, but not terribly far, there's CDL, which is an emerging standard, which, though maybe not worth getting into the details of, is a kind of mechanism for enforcing functional specifications or sort of functional standards. And so I think that's something that we should all be keeping an eye on because it is the kind of thing that I can enforce.
back to your step back there.
Sure.
I agree. Like, obviously, having the interface is better than not having the interface. Do you think that the market is educated enough to understand that? Like, I feel like I run into a lot of situations, and I think the classic example of this in our industry is people specify BASs with BACnet. The BAS supports BACnet, and then you go into the building and realize none of the integration is done through BACnet. None of the process values that you need to integrate another piece of equipment that's BACnet from a different vendor are available in the BACnet network. And you've filled the requirement of supporting a BACnet interface, but because there's no function tied to it, you are basically starting from ground zero when you go to add that next piece of equipment. That happens over
Often.
and over
Yeah.
and over again.
Yes.
And I guess to me, it feels like we shoot ourselves in the foot with that. Two things happen. One, clients don't get the value they were promised. And I think to your point, like no one promised that because it wasn't in the spec, but it looked like it was to
Yeah.
a client who, maybe doesn't do this every day. And two, it gives standards a bad name. So far, in almost every instance I've talked to someone who, has a distaste for BACnet specifically, because I just deal with it a lot. You start diving in, well, why do you not like BACnet? And you start uncovering these stories of, well, I had the thing that said it supported BACnet, and we connected to the BACnet network, and nothing, like we couldn't do anything with it. And yeah, it was there, it was present, and it was compatible, but nothing, like we couldn't actually achieve any of the outcomes that we had imagined when we thought to ourselves, I'm going to have a BACnet enabled chiller or, whatever piece of equipment. So I think it's a really big problem that we put too much responsibility on the client to understand, and why I think we need things like guideline 36.
Totally. Now, something that I want to say, and I'm going to try to do this tactfully because I've been trying to figure in my head how I say this correctly. But you kind of said it in a way that was more clever than I could have come up with, which is that we put too much pressure on the client to understand these things. Absolutely, that's certainly the case. However, as you were describing the scenario where somebody wrote in a specification that a BAS was supposed to be backnet tip to tail, and then 4 years later, when the thing is built, they realize that at the first time they go to service that it wasn't. That sounds like a failure of the specifying engineer, not of the certainly not the client's responsibility to know that. That's why they have consultants and engineers. And so I have certainly been on bids where part of the job is to look through the response and ensure that not just like the letter of the contract, but the spirit of the contract is being met. And I don't personally think that's too high of a bar to sort of expect of our specifying engineers. I think lots of them, what they absolutely see as part of their job. Now, do I think that there are probably too few specifying engineers who really intimately understand the BAS world? Probably, yeah. I think that's probably maybe more of the issue than just that it cannot be done. And I think part of that is just that, unfortunately, lots of folks who um, specify equipment sort of might feel like it is sufficient to say, okay, it has to be BACnet compatible, but don't have the sort of background themselves to go and then suss out whether or not implementation is appropriate or not, because they don't deal with this all day long. And so maybe to wrap all this up, I think that certainly it's not a client's fault and they shouldn't have to be an expert in this. This is the point of engineers and consultants. But I think that, if I'm running a firm, I want to make sure, and I'm telling people that I can specify for them or design for them properly open system, I want to make sure that I have people who have the depth of knowledge required, because surface level is not going to cut it.
The other thing that I think comes up a lot in, when we're talking about this industry is cost. I think the frustration that I hear a lot could be summed up in that, like, I buy a smartphone and I can keep loading applications on it. The software, supports updates. Maybe they become obsolete a little more frequently than we would like, but ultimately they still kind of function and you can continue to update software for years. And then we talk to people with, when you're buying BAS equipment, it's like you buy a controller, you know, it is kind of going to be what it is when you get it, not likely to get a whole lot of updates unless there's like a major security, vulnerability. And then, when there is a major update, you're expected to buy, an upgrade path or pay for, licensing, et cetera. Why isn't this technology more like um, what we expect on the consumer side?
That's a question I ask myself every day, and is part of the reason that I'm currently in the middle of a PhD, is to get to the bottom of that. And I think that both as a professional and as a researcher, I can tell you that the reason isn't technical. There is no technical barrier that is preventing us from having an automation system that is a constellation of individually upgradable parts that is easy to repair and easy to upgrade as my needs change. I think that for the overwhelming history of the BAS industry, the money has been in service contracts, and so there's a and this is a horse that's been beaten to death, but to answer the question, I think the answer is that there hasn't been a lot of incentive for making it easy to repair things, like whether they be software or hardware. It's sort of there's been no incentive for things to be modular and serviceable, because if anyone off the street can come and fix my BAS, then I no longer have the stickiness of the BAS service contract that I like as an equipment manufacturer. And so, I mean, yeah, certainly not technical. I think it's just that easier business if I don't have things serviceable by all kinds of people.
It's a very cynical answer, and I've been searching for another one, and I haven't found one. It's sad. I don't I don't think it's always maybe as, like, conspiratorially intentional as it may have sounded, but I do think it's the reality. Like, whether or not anyone's sitting back and saying, "Hey, we're going to do this, from a top-down strategy. This is what we're trying to do." I think what happens is individual decisions get weighed against last year's service revenue,
Yeah,
and when they don't, when it doesn't look like they're gonna support last year's numbers plus a little bit this year, those decisions go a different way. And, it's a very simple just a very simple market response to the metric you're measuring, which is last year's revenue.
yeah. I mean, I obviously that my answer can certainly come across as conspiratorial, but I think you said it well, that it isn't. No one is assuming that deals are being made in back rooms, but the simple reality is that the incentives are aligned in such a way that it makes sense to do whatever you can to make a service contract as sticky as possible. And so the sort of future that I think both you and I and probably most owners are looking for is one in which the incentives change such that hardware and software vendors are incentivized, maybe through something as simple as you don't get the bid if you do not comply with this philosophy, but incentivized to have a system that is serviceable by as many people as possible. Um, not dissimilar in sort of philosophy from like a right to repair idea. So I think the incentives fundamentally sort of are the problem, and we need new ones.
One thing that I hear folks who have, are in the industry or have been doing things or part of the system that have been doing things the same way, when you start talking about, well, why can't we just buy, something like an iPhone and use it in a building? And, their arguments are along the lines, well, everyone needs a camera, everyone needs a calendar, everyone needs, contacts. Like the iPhone use cases are much more universal, whereas buildings tend to be these snowflakes. Do you think that's really a technical barrier? I think I liked what you just said about this constellation of things that can work together. When you have that, like, composability, I feel like you get the same flexibility that we want or we expect out of the systems we have today, but through composition of generic or commodity tools versus this like one-off, custom baked BAS implementation for every site. Is that a fair view?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you actually summarized it pretty well. But I don't think that there is the costs of things being as high as they are. I don't like, at least from say a hardware perspective, isn't a product of the snowflake nature of individual buildings, because the equipment that you use are fundamentally modular. Like just when like that's just how they're sort of designed and procured. And like there's a reason it's called general purpose IO. It's because it is general purpose by definition. So I think that part of the reason that upfront costs of any new BAS are as high as they are isn't necessarily because the hardware is somehow super bespoke and has to have all these special parameters. Like the electronics inside of them are fairly standard. But I think your point about like buildings are sufficiently different that the amount of engineering and the sort of complexity of commissioning that set of modular parts into a cohesive whole is done on a kind of building by building basis, which is labor intensive. And in a country like the US where labor is expensive, that's part of the reason, like a pretty straightforward reason why BASs themselves as a total entity are expensive. However, there is plenty of work going on in industry and academia right now looking at ways to make that snapping together of this constellation of parts, whether they be hardware or software, happen in a less labor intensive way. And yeah, I don't, again, there's no technical barrier per se. We just haven't sort of developed the exact set of standards and processes to make buildings come together from these disparate parts very quickly. But it's people are working on it for sure. And it's a noble endeavor because that's what we need to help the total cost of ownership go down.
So my last kind of set of questions here, we touched on this a little bit. We were talking about evaluating a BAS and its readiness for new applications. But I've been, in this industry for 6 or 8 years now. If you had asked me 6 or 8 years ago, like, what I thought was gonna happen soon, I would have said more grid interaction with buildings. And then I feel like I've talked to people who've been in this business for 30 years, and I talk to them about grid interaction, and they say they've been talking about that for 20 years. Why why don't we have this yet? Why do we have this huge set of loads in our grid that are not being collaborative in managing our power demand as it grows?
This is also something that I think about all day long, and so I'm going to struggle probably to present you with a nice sort of soundbite answer. But doing my best to try to present this in a linear way, I think it starts with the fact that, I mean, like a lot of things, like the economics are not yet figured out such that there is sufficient incentive, economically speaking, to participate in grid interactivity programs to justify the missing hardware, software, and labor to actually participate in that program in the first place. And I think that's something which I certainly don't know how to solve, but I think is something that has to be figured out for this to become as widespread as everybody thinks it should be. Maybe I'll pause there. Do you have some thoughts to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think what I see is that because of the lack of composability, because of the treatment of all these systems as snowflakes, that's why the labor cost for getting grid interactivity is so high. And it feels like if we can address those through some of the efforts you were just describing a few minutes ago, that definitely makes that incentive not quite as hard to make. Right now, it's very hard. Yeah. Have you seen early success? Like, are there entities who are doing this, maybe not because the incentives are there, but because they think it's the right thing to do, or maybe they have separate organizational goals that justify the cost due to some of the ancillary benefits like carbon generation or those sorts of things?
In the balance, I would say no, I haven't seen people who are doing it because there's some reason other than economics that is driving their decision. I'm sure that those people exist, but I haven't personally worked with them.
Okay.
Yeah. But what I will say is that the people who are participating in these programs that I have worked with and that I know do it because having a fairly sophisticated BMS was already required for that building to operate in the first place. And so for them, they're going for, like, they started here and they're going to here, right? They already have sophisticated infrastructure and sophisticated suite sequences. What's one more thing, right? As a percentage of the total project costs, it becomes possible to say, well, I was guaranteed to be spending this much, and now I might actually make some money if I spend just this little bit extra. But I think it's important to remember that as of at least 2018, when the last data set was published, only 1 in 5 buildings in the US had a BAS as you and I know it. And so if 4/5 of buildings don't have even sort of rudimentary whole building level control, I don't think it's unexpected at all that grid interactivity at scale hasn't been realized, because 4/5 of buildings don't have the sort of fundamental level of whole building control that is required. And so if I say to them, hey, look, I need you to invest a bunch of money in becoming grid interactive, there's this massive hurdle that they have to clear first, which they already haven't figured out how to make the economics work. And so, yeah, like to sort of wrap up, I think in the places where I have seen it, it's because it didn't really cost, I say that money or labor or sort of time. It didn't cost a tremendous amount extra. Whereas for most of the people that I talk to about this issue, like there's so much upfront energy to be spent getting the building to a level, sort of a baseline level of intelligence, that they can't clear that hurdle. Certainly not 2 in a row like that.
So maybe, I mean, it sounds like the answer to the question of what needs to change is it's a little bit of both. It's the incentives need to be more clear, and the process for delivering it needs to be easier, which I think is what you've been working on and why I was so excited to talk to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I just to give a shout out to folks who work in buildings different than the ones that I work in. I think that if you look at some of the awesome work that's happening in the residential building space around this issue of grid interactivity, they have found ways where it is, basically by integrating two specific pieces of equipment, that I bypass the requirement of having a BAS, which I'm not sure that that's necessarily compatible with commercial buildings, but I just think that it's like kudos should be given to them because they found a way to sort of get there with the least amount of input energy. I think that's worth celebrating a little bit.
Yeah, I can imagine, if you have a boiler with your heat pump boiler with automatic a heat pump chiller with automatic demand response built in, and all of a sudden your building temperature loop changes because the utility and you're not prepared for it or coordinating it in the BAS, that can make a big mess, which I think maybe is
Enormous
part of
mess.
why, yeah, we haven't seen that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for spending so much time with us. You've given so many good insights here. I think I leave this conversation optimistic. Just the fact knowing folks like you are working on it, I think gives me a lot of optimism. Seeing some of the things, like I think you mentioned CDL,
Yep.
ASHRAE 221,
231, 231.
231. Sorry, yeah, ASHRAE 231. That's exciting. Folks should go check that out if they haven't.
Yes.
Yeah, this has been super great having you, and really appreciate your input, and look forward to seeing what comes of your PhD program. I know you're going to be a change maker, so I'm excited to see the changes that your work is going to enable.
Well, you're very kind, Andrew, and thank you very much for having me. It's, as always, been a wonderful conversation.